The reason we produced this book on India and a warming world is that India both has sustainable development priorities, that is India's main priority, but increasingly, in order to achieve sustainable development, we have to think about climate change. Both of these objectives are interlinked and we can't do without either of them. Take sustainable development. India is growing rapidly, we have to create many, many jobs, but we also have to do it in a way that doesn't choke our rivers, that doesn't pollute our air, that doesn't litter our landscape with mines. So, how do we bring these things together? At the same time, when it comes to climate change has the potential of making development challenges harder to manage. So, climate change might lead to crop yields going down, it might make health impacts worse, it might lead to our cities being flooded. So, we have to address both of these issues. So, if sustainable development is our objective and climate change is a possible obstacle to it, it can also be seen as an opportunity. Climate change requires that we take seriously environmental issues that often get put to the side. So, for example, Delhi's air, much of the Indo Gangetic Plain, the whole northern part of India is suffering from terrible air. We have struggled to find a way to address this. But if we are also trying to address climate change, there are things that we can do to address both challenges. We can, for example, think about moving from a coal based power plant system to a renewable energy based power plant system. Now, in the past, this was very expensive to do, but renewable energy has become cheaper. By moving to renewable energy, we could address both challenges. To take another example, our cities are increasingly choked with congestion. If we build our cities around public transport, it helps with air quality, it also helps with climate change. So there are opportunities to try and bring these two objectives together, which is the good news part of the story. The challenge is that it's not easy to do this. So if you are organizing your policy and you're trying to achieve multiple objectives at the same time, so it's not just air quality and local environment, it's not just climate change, but it's also creating jobs. Will we be able to make this transition by generating more jobs? Will we do it in a way that poorest people don't bear the brunt of the transition? Because we also have to think about the distributional impacts. Will we do it in a way that allows for better governance so that we don't create systems that foster corruption? These are the kinds of challenges that India has to face. But what is very clear is that a business as usual model where we pursue development without thinking about its environmental consequences, without thinking in particular about climate change, is no longer viable. Let us take another sector. Let us take agriculture. Increasingly, what we see is that Indian agriculture will be faced with the risks of declining crop yield. Some estimates say that for every degree rise in temperature, we could see a 6% decline in rice yields. That could be catastrophic for a country like India, where actually our needs for food are going up. We're talking about millions of tons of food less that are produced per year. So we have to think about our agricultural system in ways that are also climate resilient. Often, when it comes to climate change, we get told, look, India didn't cause this problem, the West caused this problem, they should take the lead in solving it. And that's true. India has had a relatively small role to play over time in leading to the buildup of greenhouse gases. That's because the West developed earlier and India started from a much lower base. We're a much poorer country. At the same time, because of the size and scale and population of India, we are now the world's third largest emitter. And in the future, as other countries decline their emissions, our share is only going to go up. So, is that a reason for India to necessarily take the lead? Maybe not. But the reason India should be engaged in this conversation is because it is in our enlightened self interest. Ultimately, India is a deeply vulnerable country. And as I've already said earlier, there are many things we can do that actually help our development. So, India should actually be in the forefront of trying to get the West and other countries, including China, to do much more than they are doing to address climate change. In the book, India in a Warming World, we have sections from various negotiators who have represented India in the past, as well as from civil society representatives who take issue with some of the positions that India has taken. So we have a robust discussion in the volume on exactly what India should do. What is heartening and clear from the book is also that the Indian public is beginning to get more engaged with this issue. They're beginning to understand, as you can see through representations of climate change in the media. We see many more articles in the media. We see many more articles about domestic policy and not just about global politics. So, for many years, when people thought about climate change, it was thought of as some UN issue, something you talked about once a year when the UN has some big conference. Increasingly, I think we need to shift the perspectives towards thinking about climate change as a day to day issue. For climate change to make sense in India, we have to understand it as something that affects our lives on a day-to-day basis. One of my colleagues in the book writes about the Sundarbans, for example, and how you see the impact of the ravages of climate change on the Sundarbans already. So these are the kinds of things that I think animate our conversation. And what we hope with this volume is that it will provide the base information that the public can begin to start thinking about climate change and about how it actually makes sense given our day-to-day concerns. So when we get asked the question, should India as a poor country really focus on climate change? Or should we be focusing on other pressing issues? I think the only way to really approach that question is that we have to focus on both of these things. And we have to get the world to focus on climate change as well. Because India can't solve this problem by itself. But it is also the case that the world probably cannot solve this problem without India, because our emissions are now sufficiently large. Uh, does this mean that we have to sacrifice development? I think the studies in the book suggest that we don't. In areas as diverse as agriculture, water, urbanization, energy, there are ways in which we can meet both of these objectives. There are some, in a sense, no regrets policies. For example, efficiency of water use. We should be working for more efficient water use anyway as a country because we are a water scarce country. But by doing that, we will also become more climate resilient. So we have to look for these areas where these agendas go together. Another concern that we have in India is that we will get pressured to do much more than we otherwise should do. In other words, more than our fair share. And historically, looking at global climate negotiations, that has indeed been a concern. You see around the world that some Western countries, the US, to some extent Australia, to some extent Canada, are pulling back from some of their commitments, or at least there's discussion in those countries about pulling back. This is, of course, of huge concern for India. But does it mean that we should also then pull back? I would argue not, because in our own self-interest, because we are vulnerable, we need to move forward and we need to actually try and push other countries to take more aggressive measures. Now, are we in a situation now globally where we are well placed to solve this problem? Unfortunately, the answer has to be no. We have a global agreement in place, the Paris Agreement. The pledges that countries have put on the table are better than what they had in place before the Paris Agreement, but they're not adequate to the task. So the coming 5 to 10 years is really going to be critical. And I think part of the dynamic has to be for countries to actually demonstrate through their own national policies that they're taking productive measures, and then use that to encourage other countries to do the same thing. But the key really is, the absolute key, is that we have to find ways where development and climate change can actually reinforce each other and pursue those aggressively.